Hello and welcome to Module 2, Week 2 of our course, which is focused on Chapter 2. Easy to keep that straight. This chapter's themes include, as again the chapter title suggests, consolidating the empire. The South Sea bubble is going to figure large into this module. Again, the Jacobites. Know who the Jacobites were? For those of you who studied the French Revolution, the Jacobites in English history at this time are quite different. Let's start, though, with talking about these economic changes. And this is one thing to point out, that, again, the British Empire is consolidated around economic issues and economic conflicts. And the South Sea Company, which is associated with that South Sea bubble, it's one of the first modern stock market crashes in British history, certainly. I wouldn't say in world history, because there'd been plenty of economic crashes before that, but this one is different because, think of it this way, it's largely on paper, right? It's the first great modern stock market crash. Especially devastating for the wealthy because, carriage makers and makers of luxury goods, the people that were buying all of these very expensive items, were left out in the cold. The workers were, of course, but also the wealthy people who were buying them. Houses were left unfinished, unbuilt. It drew condemnation, and there was a political backlash to it as well. It drew the economy into a deep recession, if not what we'd call in modern parlance, modern language, depression. Churches, of course, as they often did, blamed the greed of the investing class and the investors, and posed questions about the morality of England and the direction of the company. This is a time as well when the Hanoverian kings would be the new line of royalty, of succession. A lot of the issues that were dominant in the 17th century still appear in this, especially first quarter of the 18th century. So let's jump into how this South Sea bubble occurred, and we go into you read about this in the beginning of chapter 2, about how there was this thing called irredeemable debt. The government started running up big bills, largely due to expenditures for war. And one way that they found of getting around this was to sell shares. The government would sell government debt, and then you could buy those treasury bonds, essentially. And then this would give you a dividend or a guaranteed income over time. It all worked well until interest rates would start crashing. And then that caused a crisis because the government could no longer afford to pay out the dividends for those treasury bonds or the interests, right? So this starts a real avalanche of corruption as well. So the East India Company is asked to join in and assist the government in loaning it money. In exchange, the government would give away these monopolies for trade, or for trading items. So the East India Company and the Royal African Company, and even the South Sea Company that starts around this time, will get involved in these schemes of buying treasury bonds from the government. The South Sea Company was a little different because it was started by Tories. And this was an attempt for, remember we have these two, they're not really political parties so much at this time as political factions. Tories and Whigs. Tories being more supportive of, in general, royal authority. They tended sometimes to think, at least, and consider throwing their lot in with the Jacobites, or with restoring of the Stuart line of royal succession. But the South Sea Company becomes involved in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, that's where the economic action in Spain had been setting up. Remember your world history, these encomiendas, these that's the Spanish name for these plantations. It's these engines of wealth. And at the Treaty of Utrec, the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the expensive wars that Britain got itself into, they do have some, they do get some good benefits, economic benefits for them, because they get this toehold into the Caribbean Sea. And this is a time as well when Britain becomes more and more enters into the African slave trade as well. Okay, so you got the Treaty of Utrecht, you got the Act of Settlement after the Glorious Revolution, which had denied the right of assuming the throne, the right of the throne of the king. You couldn't be Catholic, right? Pretty simple. This barred James Stuart from taking the throne, or his descendants. The controversy occurs, of course, when Queen Anne dies, and who's going to be the successor. She passes in 1714, and some want to bring James Stuart back, or it's actually his son. It would be, had he ascended the throne, it would have been James III. His supporters then are known as the Jacobites, the supporters of the Stuart line, the supporters of James. James, of course, though, refuses to convert to Protestantism, so a lot of the Whigs and the English establishment want to ignore him, and even some of the probably Scots Presbyterians as well want to ignore him. There's a lot of support for the Jacobites, though, at this time, especially given the unpopularity of the government because of the economic problems, anti-Whig riots, pro-Jacobite demonstrations occurred in the south and west of England. These were the dissenters. They were mostly Protestant Puritans. It's interesting when you compare and contrast American history with British history. In our American history, especially that history you get when you're in sort of middle school into high school, always puts Puritans forward, and oftentimes, at least in the past, has put Puritans forward as these heroes and these people who establish, of course, the Northeast, or the pilgrims who come to the Northeast of this country, into Massachusetts, for example. But in English history, they were considered, British history, they were the radicals, right? They would have been very much anti-Jacobites as well. So you have, the Jacobites and their followers are Catholics and dissenters, and then all over on the other side of the spectrum, you have Puritans who also are dissenters, right? Who don't dissenters are anyone who doesn't want to join the officially recognized Church of England. You have two different risings in Scotland during this period that are covered in this chapter. You have the rising of 1750, and then you have another rising in 1745 in Scotland. The rising in 1715, probably they had a better chance at that point in 1715 after the death of Queen Anne, but it ends ignominiously, as the word is that your textbook uses without, right, any great victory. In fact, with defeat. For the, you can read about the details in typical Scottish style. There's a lot of glory and defeat in both of these risings in 1715 and in 1745. This is when, as well, you have the South Sea bubble, and what happens? The corruption that what happens here is that there begins to be all of these bribes for people to loan government to to buy these treasury bonds, right? And that corruption really makes the government unpopular. There's a secret committee set out to investigate the bubble, and out of that investigation emerges the leader, Robert Walpole. He's the screen master, as your textbook reminds us he was called in his time, right? He becomes the secretary of the treasury, essentially the head of the treasury. He's the British call the treasurer, the head of the treasurer, the exchequer. So it's important that you learn some of this vocabulary, so when you're reading about British history, you don't get confused by these rather simple terms, or everyday terms almost, in the British vocabulary or vernacular. But sometimes we as Americans, we're not familiar with that, so I just want to point out, getting used to the vocabulary. There was at this time, because of the backlash against the government, because of the South Sea bubble crash and the corruption, an increase in the popularity of the Jacobites. The pretenders. The pretender are Bonnie Prince Charles of Scotland. Later on in 1745, the Stuart line of succession, right? The Catholic Stuart line, which had been overthrown, of course, earlier in the so-called glorious revolution. And we see as well the rise of the East India Company at this time. And supporters of the Jacobites as well are going to be put down with a great deal of force. You can read about the execution of Christopher Layer, for example. You also have, after that Treaty of Utrec and the entry into the Caribbean of the British Empire, a rise in the amount of money involved in the slave trade, in the African slave trade. We can't make any, mince any words about this. The South Sea Company and all of the major companies, the Royal African Company most particularly, but also the East India Company, they're all involved in this emergence of an overseas market for what would be sold back in England as consumer goods. We're talking about coffee, we're talking tea, sugar, and chocolate, all those sweet things. The East India Company is not going to be so much involved in the coffee and the chocolate as they are in tea, and they're the ones that promote both sugar and tea for British consumers. In the Caribbean, it's going to be the colony of Barbados. It's the most productive of the British colonies in the Caribbean. Important to realize about these colonies in the Caribbean, and even the eventual colonies in Asia, such as those in India, is that they won't involve large numbers of British soldiers, British settlers. Remember, we studied the Darien venture, that ill-fated attempt to begin a Scottish company in what is today Panama. Well, there were a large, 500 people I think were involved in that. It was just a spearhead beginning venture. But unlike the Massachusetts Bay Colony, for example, in this country that's dominated by Puritan, these dissenters, the Caribbean colonies will not be heavily settled by English people. It will mostly be merchants and their families and officials who are associated with empire that settle in those areas. So they also become slave-based plantations as well. It's that part of the Treaty of Utrec that I mentioned earlier. It's called the Asiento in Spanish. That section of the treaty that gives British trading rights and trading privileges in Africa and the Caribbean. This helps to usher in this new economic era of the triangular trade that you all have studied, I think, in my classes before or in other world history classes, certainly. The main struggle at this time in the 17th century remains that between Britain and Spain, and this breaks out. We have a number of these wars. The War of the Austrian Succession. Earlier, we had the War of the Spanish Succession. Then we have the War of the Austrian Succession, and those involve this power struggle between the British and the Spanish. And this is even when there are times of peace at this during the 18th century, it seems. British and Spanish vessels are often harassing each other on the high seas and blaming the other as being pirates. Okay, then we have the Rising in Scotland, led by Bonnie Prince Charles, the Pretender. He becomes tired of waiting on the French. One of the themes of these risings is that the Scottish will often be waiting for French assistance. And the Irish, too, at times also in their rebellions, they will often ally themselves with Catholic France, right? Again, another country, because of its rivalries colonially with Great Britain, but also because it's a Catholic country, and France and Britain are often at odds with each other too. But the Prince Bonnie Charlie, as he was called, becomes tired of waiting for the French to arrive in the summer of 1745. He lands himself there in Scotland, tries to rally people to his standard, to his flag, and the Rising meets an ignominious defeat. There is a pretty atrocious loss of life, a massacre, many might call it, of Scottish Highlanders committed by Cumberland. You can read about that in your textbook, and then you can read as well about the 7 Years' War, one of the first of these great global wars. So the wars of the Spanish Succession and the Austrian Succession, I'll leave that to you to read about in your textbooks. But the war of between 1756 and 1763, the 7 Years' War, or as it's known in this country as a French and Indian War, is one that goes badly at first for the British. It's fought on 3 continents, as we learned if you took my early modern history course. We look at this war in some detail. But by the end of it, the British sea power and British support by people like George Washington and this part of the world in the 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America, the British end up getting some favorable terms out of the 7 Years' War. Part of the reason, too, that your textbook at least cites for the success and the strengthening military of the British during this time is the involvement of the Highland Scots in the army at this time. So usually the Highland Scots had been skeptical of British involvement in the British army or the English army, but now they realize there's some career opportunities there for them. And there's opportunity for them in the empire outside of Scotland. Also, this idea that the British Empire, unlike the Catholic empires of France and Spain, were based more on trade than on conquest, more on the economy and economic betterment than on military brute strength, right? I need to warn you against this kind of interpretation. This is what we might call a Whig interpretation of history, a very British interpretation of history. When the British look at their empire, especially at that time, they say, of course it was good, right? We're lifting everyone's boats higher. Well, try to explain that to the majority of people who live on the island of Barbados, right? They're mostly enslaved persons, or on the British colony of Jamaica as well. So the other thing that the 7 Years' War brings is India into the British Empire as an economic hub in Asia, and the East India Company then again starts setting up more and more of these tea plantations there, and begins as well setting up a kind of British-friendly government there in India. Okay, so that's a quick overview of some of the themes in Chapter 2 of your textbook. I look forward to our discussion this week. More on the website soon.
Brightness at max. Stop taking video.